don't you talk about Javier Cabrera and the Ica stones? When did you find out about him, and what's been your...
We had a picture of a human skull in a limestone boulder, huge boulder, about 20 tons, we'd estimated, that had fallen off a cliff. It was tertiary, which is the layer just above where the dinosaurs are supposed to become extinct. So maybe 60 million years. A human skull embedded in it, and it had tumbled down, and it was there on the beach there in Peru. And we began to calculate, we'd like to have that boulder right out here in front of the museum, a 20-ton boulder that we're just going to pick up and run off with. We'd actually worked the logistics out and have it shipped through Galveston and transported, and so Dr. Swift and I went down. Dr. Swift had been there and had seen it and then had to photograph. So he came back and got me, and we went down, and by the time we got there, or in between, it was about 2 months from when he saw it and then we were able to return. There were several newspaper articles that had appeared locally describing it. And when we got there, it had been bashed to pieces. The skull was gone, and there was this hole there where the skull was, which was extremely disappointing because we were ready to take that 20-ton boulder back to Glen Rose. And the skull was gone. We did document that the hole was there and the kind of opposition. Somebody thought it was significant and took the trouble to destroy it. While we were there, we interviewed Dr. Cabrera, and in the process learned more and more and more of what he was able to reveal. He'd been collecting the burial stones for years. His father had actually begun back in the 30s collecting the burial stones from the Inca tombs, and we were able to actually get into some of the tombs and see some of the in situ burial stones in the tombs and photograph that. But he had a collection of some 11,000 of these stones there in the front of his huge mansion, which is on the square there in Inca. It was built by the conquistadors. He's a descendant, not of the Indians, but of the Spanish conquistadors. He is an eminent scientist. He performed the first heart surgery in Peru, heart transplant. He was 20 years head of the Department of Medicine at the University of Lima and established the teaching hospital there in Inca, and actually established the museum there in Inca, which now they refuse to acknowledge his work there. An interesting story there with the museum, because Carlos Solte, who was registrar of the Museum of Engineers in Lima, had also excavated some of these burial stones and then donated them to that museum in Inca. We interviewed his brother, who said he had, at his brother's death, had donated the stones. So we went to the museum, Dr. Swift and I, asked to see them, though they don't exist. They're not real. And we showed pictures. We knew that they were there. Well, okay, they're here, but they're in storage. Well, okay, we're not in a big hurry. We'd like to see them. Well, you have to have an official document from a chartered museum in order for us to give you permission to see them, which was nonsense, but that was a rule he made up on the spot. Fine. It took us 2 days to get that. We had it faxed from the U.S. and presented it to him, and then he wouldn't even come out to meet us. He sent his assistant out and said, "Sorry, I don't care if you've got the permit, you've got the document, we will not allow you to see them." It was 2 years later when Dr. Swift did finally get to see them and did examine them himself. They are there, just like what Cabrera has in his museum in the front of his house, huge mansion there. He has 11,000, in addition, other artifacts that he doesn't show most of the time. Of course, he's passed away, I think, in 2002. He is a very unusual man, obviously a genius. He's got some very unusual ideas. He believes in the billions of years, millions of years for dinosaurs. But that man was back millions of years ago, and obviously was intelligent because of the depictions on the stones of what appears to be brain surgery and heart transplants that he could see on the stones. He could see some cesarean births taking place and the operations, the placenta, all depicted on these stones from tombs 1,500 to 2,500 years ago. And of course, he had a great interest in this, not so much in the dinosaurs as we were, but more in the technology that he was able to detect in the stones. We wanted to see the dinosaurs, and about a third of them had dinosaurs on them. All varieties, very specific, not just general variety, but this species and that species. Some of them very large, 4 or 5 feet across. Most of them football size, but all ranges of sizes, 11,000 of them. About a third of them with dinosaurs, very clear ones. Some had suggested that he carved them all, which, 11,000 seems a little bit like overkill. And what would the head of the medical department for 20 years be doing carving on stones then? It just didn't make any sense at all. Besides that, Dr. Swift had done experimentation at the University of Bonn in Germany, finding patina in the grooves, doing even carbon-14 on the patina, showing clearly that they were not modern. Now, some since then have been carved, but it's very easy. I mean, just a school child could see the difference. But we were able to bring some of them back. It was a museum-to-museum transfer because it's illegal to bring antiquities out.
Boy, I guess one of the things we always get is, why isn't there any human fossils in the fossil record? Where are the human bones? And can you comment on that and the Malachite Man discovery?
There are human bones, and the Malachite Man discovery, I think, is a good indication of that. But the general answer, and it calls for more response than that, because there are billions and billions and billions of clams, and not that many human fossils. Now, there are some. Brace, in his Human Fossil Atlas, Lawrence C. Brace, who's one of the leading paleoanthropologists in this country, documents just over 3,000 human fossils. So to say there are not that many is, relative to the clams, yes, but there are quite a few. But the difference, I think, calls for an explanation. Why? Well, what most people don't realize is that the fossil record is, well, you look at the geologic column and it's almost all the vertebrates, which is a gross distortion. 95% of the entire fossil record is of marine invertebrates. And then another 4.5% are plants and algae. Well, that's most of it. See if I can recall the figure. 0.00125%. About 1/100% of the entire fossil record are of vertebrates. Now, there are a lot more vertebrates in general than there are humans, but we need to understand almost all the fossil record is of marine invertebrates. Now, why is that? I think it's a marine deposit. And why don't they show this as, why do they show it as mostly vertebrates? If you showed it as mostly marine invertebrates, you might think it's a marine deposit, a flood deposit, and they don't want to leave that impression, and so they skew it dramatically away from what is reality. I think we have a flood that buried the world that then was. God designed the flood to destroy the world that then was. It did. It buried things where they lived, and most of the things that got buried were the things that lived lowest at the bottom of the ocean, and that's what we have most of in terms of fossils. What would be buried least? Well, the things that would live highest, higher, and not at the bottom of the ocean, and would be more mobile and could have enough intelligence to get on top of the hill or grab a log, and that would be the individuals that could escape fossilization. Birds, humans, probably the least common fossil. Those are the most mobile, the ones most likely to be able to escape a catastrophic flood. And so you got humans, probably quite a few of them, buried at the last stages of the flood, up at the top. The ones that weren't buried, of course, didn't become fossils. If they can grab a log and float, then they die, they float and bloat. Reptiles sink. Mammals don't. To be a fossil, you got to get buried. And they would be the least likely. But the ones that did, and some of them would be at the highest levels. Then what happens as the flood recedes? It erases the top level. And so being buried last would be most likely also to be erased, eroded, as the floodwaters receded. And so understanding the mobility and the intelligence and the likelihood of being buried together with the erosional factor of the departure of the flood, we would predict there would be very few human fossils, which is exactly what we find. There are thousands, but there are few, relatively. Clams, and more clams is the best way to describe. That's what we would predict as well. I think it fits well with the creation model. You ask about the Malachite man. This is a very interesting phenomenon. This is the Dakota sandstone, about 100 million years ago, according to the standard geologic column. And it's sandstone that's loosely consolidated. You can dig in it with a knife. It's not real hard. Above it is hard and below it is hard. But here is loosely consolidated sandstone. And the area was exposed with an open pit copper mine in the 30s with a bulldozer. They got to a hard layer that was tearing up the bulldozers, and so they stopped and wasn't resumed until the 30s. And in the early 30s, the fellow that was driving the bulldozer uncovered skeletons. And he sort of put them aside, and finally it was noticed by one of the locals who was interested in fossils at a fossil store. Claimed the find was his. It wasn't. But there were two humans, and we had two halves because the upper halves were removed by the bulldozer. But perfectly modern human skeletons there. Some of those bones were acquired by the museum here. Some of them were kept rather fraudulently, but still were. And then in the 90s, there was more excavation being done by a fellow who had bought the area to excavate some of the azurite nodules that were there. And he ran across more bones. And so other archaeologists came in, and they actually found remains. We've now found some 10 individuals. One was an infant. 4 of them were females. We carried the bones down to the Pound Human Identification Laboratory at the University of Florida, examined by one of the best-known forensic anthropologists in the world at the the time, Mr. Maples, Dr. Maples. And one of the questions was, could there be Indians? And he said, while there's some Indian characteristics, you see those characteristics in the general population, and what you would expect to see of Indians are not there. And that his conclusion was, no, you cannot conclude that they were. They're just normal people. There was no collagen in the bones, zilch. Now, that takes normally about 1,000 years. But that was determined by field test and as well as scanning electron microscope. Zero collagen. That's not a recent burial. One of the standard this is 50 feet down in the Dakota sandstone. There was the excavation of the 30s, then of the 70s that went lower. We found aerial photographs of the area from the 30s that were made before the road cut, which showed no excavation at all. So you got the road cut in the 30s, and then the excavation of the mine, the open pit mine, and then in the 70s. All of it was straight across, undisturbed in these aerial photographs. So we see that this is definitely 50 feet down in undisturbed sandstone, the Dakota sandstone. I think it's excellent evidence. They've suggested, well, maybe it was a collapsed mine, but what's the female and the infant doing down there? Why are there no tools? In fact, some of the earlier archaeologists that worked there spent weeks screening the material, trying to find any other artifact. There were nothing but bones. These were just washed into place with the sand. And as we say often, these were fellows that missed the boat, along with a wife and kid. The last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they're the storage area where they've hidden the ark, which I have serious doubts it exists. But anyway, that picture of we have good men working on it, it's hidden, and that's a pretty real depiction. I think they hide more things than they show, and we've run into that several times. The bones from the Malachite man, as we call him, the majority of them were donated to the Museum of the Cedars, which is just a little distance away, 20 miles down the road, a nice museum by the owner of the property. We went down to photograph them, and we had asked for permission to do that. We were told we had to get permission from the BLM. We went to the BLM, the head of the BLM there in Moab, in his office, and at that time he didn't know who I was. I was a geologist. I had my geologist card, and so he thought I was one of them. And so he said, yeah, we've hidden these things. We put them in the back of the museum so nobody can see them. He said, this is a real tar baby. And the analogy to Uncle Remus and punching the tar baby and getting stuck, he said, you don't want to mess with that. But anyway, we did get permission. We photographed all of the skeletons that had been found, including the skulls. And they immediately, it was just before they were shipping them off to the Smithsonian. And they did ship them off. They left the week after I was there. But we photographed them before they went. But they were, he said specifically, they were sent there to be hidden. And they are now hidden. And I'll guarantee you, if you go to the Smithsonian and ask to see them, they'll tell you they're not there.
What about like the Yak and Barrow figurines, and who's running that deal? Why that's
a very interesting story. It's a long story. When Dr. Swift and I arrived, we had heard stories, we had seen pictures, but when we got there, they denied it. And we kept prodding and talking to people who had seen them and who had helped Waldemar Julesrud back in the 30s dig these things up. And there were people still alive who had worked with him when they were teenagers. And they told us about them, and they were there in town. Finally, we found out they were locked away in the back of the police department. Well, we want to see them. Well, the fellow with the key is gone. He won't be back for 2 days. I said, well, I'll be here for 2 days. Or I've got a crowbar, I can fix this. Finally, we got them to open the door. But of the 66 crates of figurines that they had stored, they allowed it. They said, all right, we'll let you look at 2. And we got those 2 out and photographed them, and there were several dinosaurs amongst the wide variety of animals depicted. And photographed that. We had to wait till the following year to come back with correspondence with the mayor. And finally, the mayor gave permission for us to get them out and to examine them, which we were able to do. And then in conversation with the mayor, we said, now look, Spielberg has convinced us that the world loves dinosaurs. This is controversial. What does that mean? That means you're going to get news coverage. People are going to hear about it. This is wonderful. You can be Dinosaur City. What's your most opportunistic industry here? The tourism. This is a great climate. It's the same latitude as Hawaii. Have them come see the dinosaurs. And that caught on. We now have a museum. I think they spent $150,000 of the city's money and got some other grants, and they've got them on display there in Accombaro today. And you can see the whole story and pictures of Waldemar Julesrud, who excavated them back in the 30s. They've been dated with thermoluminescent dating back to approximately 4,000 years ago. That's the most appropriate dating method for pottery. Some have dated them with radiocarbon, which is really not appropriate for pottery, but there may be some particles of carbon there. They came out some 2,000 to 3,000 years of age, but of course we've known what dinosaurs looked like for a little over 100 years. So if they're 200 years old, they have a serious problem when they're just beautiful clay ceramic representations of very specific dinosaurs from 4,000 years ago, and there are thousands of them. There's some 33,000 figurines in the collection, over 20,000, about 2,600 of them were dinosaurs from 4,000 years ago. There are still dinosaurs being excavated. We interviewed one of the fellows here. It's been about 4 years now, but he owned the bread company there. He also owned a brick factory, and he was getting the clay for his brick from an area very close to where Julesrud had excavated, and he uncovered several caches of the pottery and these figurines, and one of them was one of the most beautiful dinosaurs I've ever seen. Just a perfect specimen. That was excavated 4 years ago.
Well, what's the evolutionary spin in the museum there? What did they say?
Julesrud made them all himself.
That's what they say when you go in the
Yeah.
museum? He made all these?
Very interesting sidelight here. Perry Mason, Earl Stanley Gardner, the author of Perry Mason, heard about this, was very interested. And he, together with Professor Hapgood from the University of New Hampshire, went down to investigate. Well, he's a trained criminologist, Earl Stanley Gardner, and he knows how to investigate things. And he was saying, all right, if these things were made by Julesrud, we ought to be able to find some evidence or falsify that. Let's see if we can dig in places where it wouldn't have been possible for him to make them. The police chief had a house that was built in 1875. Julesrud arrived in the early 1900s. Okay, let's excavate under the floor of the police chief, the most reputable fellow there. They found 43 specimens under the floor. And he documented that. Errol Stanley Gardner did in his book, The Host with the Big Hat. There were also walls that had been there for over 300 years, roads that had been there for, and these were places he chose to excavate, and in each place found specimens, totally making it impossible to say Jules Rudd did this. And that's documented in his book, Host with the Big Hat, by Errol Stanley Gardner, Perry Mason. So argue with him if you want to.
And so that's totally ignored by the museum. It just says Waldemar and Jules Rudd carved all these period.
Well, the museum there in Accombro is presenting them as real. Now, you go to the Institute of Archaeology, INA, in downtown Mexico City, it's all a fraud. They, in 1954, sent 4 archaeologists to Accombro to investigate. The Institute of Archaeology did. They decided to do their own excavation. They chose their own spot about a mile from where Jules Rudd had found his. I think they were trying to dig where they weren't. And they dug and found them. Down 6 feet, they found a lot of pottery, which they acknowledged to be real, thousands of years old, Chippewa culture, about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. And they found dinosaurs with them in the same place. And the memo that they wrote, and we have a copy of the memo, was that this pottery is real, but that the dinosaurs could not be because man and dinosaurs didn't live together. And they dug it up themselves in a spot they chose. Now that was 1954, so they know, and that's why they never would give us a permit. We went down with 3 times to try to get permits, met every criteria. We actually had the application made by the director of the Museum of the Rockies. That's the fellow who was the boss of Jack Horner at the time, the famous archaeologist that was featured in Jurassic Park. His boss went with us, and he signed the application. He made the application through the museum, and we also made an application through University of Texas. One of the professors there, no, turned it all down. Would not allow it. They knew what was there. They'd found it themselves. They wouldn't let us dig. So, well, we were in France just a couple of years ago and found dinosaurs all over the place. I was lecturing on coexistence of humans and dinosaurs, the footprints and several of the evidences, like the burial stones and the Accombro figurines. A young lady in the audience said that she had just returned from France with her senior trip, and she had been to one of the castles there, and she saw a dinosaur carved on the side of the castle. Well, Carl and I have found that about 1 out of 20 stories that we heard turn out to be anything. So we're a little skeptical. And that may be an optimistic description. But she's a very devout young lady, and she said, I think I have a picture of it. Okay. And sure enough, the next Sunday here she came and she had the picture. And there was a picture of a dinosaur that was, she said, was carved on the wall of the castle. Okay, I need to go see this. So we got Vance Nelson and together. He's a creationist up in Canada, and we traveled. And not only was there a dinosaur there were 800 dinosaurs carved on this castle, Chateau de Chambord, down toward the south of France. It's supposed to be a hunting lodge. What were they hunting? You've got dinosaurs carved all over the side of it. And then we found Chateau de Bois, which was not that far away. Also had similar dinosaurs. Looks like a Plateosaurus primarily. But then there were others as well. There were tapestries on the wall. Just obvious duckbill type dinosaurs. Dramatically represented on the tapestries from the 1300s. One of the castles was begun in the 1200s. And there was just evidence everywhere we looked. Well, I went back this spring of last year, and of course I've put this on videos and it's been on the web. And of all the tapestries and all the areas in those two castles, that area that has the dinosaurs is now walled off and you can't go in and see it. Now, why? Well, they're repairing it. Okay, but it's that specific area only that they're walling off. I don't know why, but I know what that looks like. I've had experience with that kind of thing. But you can't see it today. Now, the dinosaurs on the Chateau de Chambord, you can't miss. They're all over the place.